Hi everybody, welcome to episode 7 of Dress Histories with me, Kate Strasdin. Bringing to you just some stories from the world of dress and textile and fashion history that I think are particularly captivating. There are so many. Today I'm going to talk to you about something that certainly my students always find really interesting. I give a class to my second years about some of the artisan ateliers in Paris. And some of those traditional forms of making that support the high fashion industry, because I think very often they're the unsung heroes of that world. And the first element of it that I'm going to look at today is the Plisseurs. The Plisseurs are, I think, little known, certainly in the wider story of fashion. But they have the most amazing technique, and I've been lucky enough to go to one of the Plisseurs, one of the studios, and so we're going to look at that technique just for a few minutes today. So I hope you enjoy. So what are the Plisseurs? Well, there's a great video that you can check out online on Vimeo that actually was put out by Dior. It's called Passage number 5. This is the garment that they look at in detail. It's the recreation of a 1950s fashion illustration by René Grau, and this garment in a 50-minute film is really analysed from the initial drawing of it, right the way through to its completion and wear on the runway, and all of the different processes that involves. You wouldn't think that it would take 50 minutes to watch a film about that, but it's there. It's amazing. I'll put the link in my up on the screen, and you can see what is actually involved. And one of the processes that is involved in the making of this dress is the plisseur, the art of pleating. Pleating, of course, has had a long and interesting history within fashion. I'm not going to talk about it all today, but if you think just in the 20th century alone, garments like these amazing Peplos and Delphos dresses by Mariano Fortuny, the early 20th century through to the early 1940s. And then Alex Barton, the woman behind the House of Madame Grey, and her amazing silk jersey pleating that she used throughout her career. These are just two examples of many, many more. And Madeleine Vianney used pleating really successfully, for example, as well. So pleating is a way of manipulating and using cloth to bring interest and detail and movement to garments. But the plisseurs came to produce cloth in a very particular way. I have some examples here of what I'm talking about. So this is the inside of one of the establishments we'll look at, the House of Lognan in Paris. This is the many rolled up moulds that they used for creating the thousands of different patterned pleats that they produce. And it's an absolute treasure trove. So how do these actually work? So I was lucky enough to go to a plisseur in Florence a couple of years ago, and this is where it all starts. This is a piece of craft card, and it is, I'm going to see if you can see, we were given some samples. The craft card begins by, as you can see, it's flat, but here you have the pattern that has been penciled by hand all over this piece of card. So it is drawn incredibly meticulously, the measuring and then the pencil, it's like one of those old mosaic colouring books that I used to have as a kid. Then those pencil lines are scored. And I think you can see that you've got the frayed edges of where that's been scored here. Then the card has to start to be folded. So where the scores have been made, by hand, the piece of card has to be scored so that eventually it starts to take a shape. And this is another one here. You can see that it was just starting to be scored in And a person who knows what they're doing obviously would be able to create that piece of card into a very distinct pattern. This is one that has already been, this is a fragment of one that has been scored and folded. You can see just how bendy it is. This is the pattern. So originally that would have been flat. It's like origami in a way. It's flat, then scored, and then folded into this incredibly intricate pattern. What you can also see here is that it's not just one, but it is 2 layers. So you can see there, this is 2 layers of the cardboard, and that is the mould for the pleating. So this is the kind of subsidiary artisan atelier that supports, along with things like the embellishment, the embroidery studios, ribbon work, feather houses. These are the kinds of practices that I find completely fascinating, because again, it's often about hidden women. I've talked about this before, but it's about people whose voices we don't hear. And so I think ultimately that's what I find so interesting. So Lognan is a good example. Lognan started in Paris in 1853. It was actually started by a woman called Emily Lognan, and it was handed down through the generations. By the 1940s, they were routinely making for couture houses, particularly some of the heritage brands like Chanel, like Dior, but rarely was their work acknowledged. So, for example, when you would see runway shows, it wouldn't say skirt by Dior, pleats by Lognan, for example. That they're just part of the process, but it isn't an acknowledged factor. So how does the process actually work once these moulds, these fantastic moulds, have been made? And once these are made, they stay in situ at the studio. So for example, Lognan have only over 3,000 moulds in their studio, each one with a different pattern. So the process is this: the cloth is first ironed so that it's absolutely flat, and then it is laid between the two. So the top layer of the mould is rolled away. The flat cloth is laid on top of the lower mould, trimmed if it needs to be. Then the upper mould is laid over the top very, very carefully so that the cloth doesn't move. And then you can see here the process is that it's actually pinched together. So however that mould works, however those shapes work, it has to be pinched together. Then it is weighted and rolled until it's in a large cardboard tube. Then that process itself is really delicate and takes a long time. Then when it has been rolled up into the mould and secured, fastened with a buckle, it is placed into a vapour oven where it will sit for anywhere between 1 to 5 hours. When it has cooked, if you like, it comes out and then has to rest for several more hours. So the process of pleating a piece of cloth can take up to a day. Once it's finished, the material can be removed from the fold, and that's the point that it will be carefully protected and sent back to the house that it's come from, whether it's one of the heritage brands, whoever the customer is. So they liaise very closely about the kind of pleat that they want. Lognan has some very famous examples. For example, its sunburst pleat. They were one of the first houses to experiment with the sunburst pleat. This is the mould as it's laid out, and it was used for very famous garments. Here we have Marilyn Monroe in the William Travilla dress that she was so famously photographed in for the 7-Year Itch. That's a sunburst pleat style on that particular kind of dress. So I think we almost take pleats for granted, and yet there is this incredibly laborious process and very skillful process that goes into the making of it. Lognon stayed in the family for many years and through a number of generations, but eventually there wasn't anybody else to take on the house, and it was purchased by Chanel. Chanel had been purchasing small artisan ateliers for a number of years now, and it comes under their umbrella of the Perfection, which is all of their kind of artisanal practitioners that I think that they are trying to protect from otherwise disappearing. There are not many Plisseurs left now in Europe. In Paris, for example, there are 4 or 5. I got these moulds from the Plisseur Milady in Florence, but it's a dying craft, and it was amazing to watch them and take photographs. These are just some of my images from spending a little bit of time in this very nondescript industrial unit in the suburbs of Florence, watching the craftsmen at work, both making the moulds and then carrying out the pleating itself. In the UK, there is a plisseur called Cement. Cement pleating started in 1925, and so it's the UK's oldest pleating company. It's also been handed down through the family. This is their workshop in Hertfordshire, and it has been in production now. It's into its 3rd generation, and you can see if you go to trade shows like Graduate Fashion Week, or you will see that they have a stand. But again, I think it's just the kind of businesses that people rarely hear about or know about. And yet it produces the most amazing work. Here, for example, are just a couple of the garments that can be produced using the variety of moulds available by the plisseurs, whether they're 3-dimensional shapes, whether they're more regular pleated patterns. There's a whole range of geometry available to manipulate cloth into such amazing and wonderful outlines. And I hope that it's one of those skills that isn't lost for future generations, because it is so unique and so particular that it deserves to continue for a long time yet. So thanks for joining me again. I hope you enjoyed that little window into a different kind of practice. We'll look at another soon.